In this episode, we take the next step after vendor selection and move into one of the most important realities of security management. Choosing a vendor is not enough by itself. A business may perform a careful review, ask smart questions, and feel confident that a provider looks strong on paper, but that confidence becomes much more durable when the relationship is supported by clear contractual security requirements and steady ongoing oversight. For a beginner, this topic is really about learning how trust becomes formal, visible, and enforceable once an outside company begins handling important services, data, or operational responsibilities. Security leaders cannot rely on memory, goodwill, or informal promises when a vendor relationship affects confidentiality, integrity, availability, resilience, or legal obligations. That is why this subject matters so much in the Certified Information Security Manager (CISM) world. Good security management does not stop at deciding a vendor seems acceptable. It continues by defining expectations clearly in the contract and then monitoring the relationship over time to make sure those expectations remain real. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful place to begin is understanding why the contract matters so much in a security relationship. Many new learners think of contracts mainly as legal paperwork about payment terms, service delivery, and basic responsibilities. But in security management, the contract is also one of the main tools for turning broad expectations into obligations that can be reviewed, challenged, and enforced. If a vendor will store sensitive information, support critical systems, or connect to the organization's environment, then the security requirements of that relationship should not live only in meeting notes or in someone's memory from the selection process. They should be written into the agreement in a way that makes responsibilities clear to both sides. Without that discipline, the organization may discover too late that its assumptions were never actually promised by the vendor in a binding way. A strong contract helps reduce misunderstanding before trouble begins. It gives structure to the relationship and creates a reference point for accountability when service, control quality, or incident response no longer matches what the business thought it was getting. This matters because vendor risk often changes once the relationship becomes operational. During selection, the organization is mostly evaluating claims, documents, and general signs of maturity. After the contract is signed, the vendor begins performing real work, handling real information, supporting real business processes, and interacting with real deadlines, staffing pressures, and customer expectations. That is when security requirements move from theory into daily dependence. A contract, therefore, needs to do more than describe the service in broad terms. It should communicate what level of protection the organization expects around access, data handling, reporting, resilience, cooperation during incidents, and other key risk areas that fit the nature of the service. In simple terms, the contract becomes part of how the buyer says this is what secure service looks like in this relationship. That clarity protects both sides because the vendor knows what is expected, and the customer has a stronger foundation for governance when questions, failures, or changing conditions appear later. Strong contract language is not about distrust for its own sake. It is about disciplined clarity before reliance becomes deep. One of the easiest ways to understand contractual security requirements is to think of them as the bridge between risk assessment and ongoing operations. During assessment, the organization identifies what matters, what could go wrong, and what level of risk needs to be controlled. The contract should then reflect those priorities in practical terms. If the vendor is handling personal information, the contract should say something meaningful about privacy responsibilities, access limitations, retention, and notification duties. If the vendor supports a critical business function, the contract should reflect resilience expectations, recovery obligations, and communication during disruption. If the vendor has privileged access or operational control over important systems, then responsibilities around identity, monitoring, background screening, change control, and evidence may need to be addressed. The exact content will differ by relationship, but the underlying principle stays the same. The contract should not be generic when the risk is specific. A mature security program tries to make the written obligations match the real exposure rather than relying on vague language that sounds serious but leaves too much open to interpretation when the stakes rise. A major lesson for beginners is that not every vendor needs the exact same contractual language. Just as vendor risk assessment should be risk-based, contractual requirements should also be matched to the importance and nature of the relationship. A low-risk supplier with little or no access to sensitive information usually does not require the same depth of security obligations as a provider hosting business-critical systems, processing customer records, or maintaining administrative connectivity. Trying to force every vendor into one oversized template can slow the business down without improving protection in meaningful ways. At the same time, using a minimal contract for a high-risk relationship is a serious weakness because it leaves too much depending on assumptions. The goal is proportionality. Security leaders should work with legal, procurement, privacy, and business owners to decide which obligations are truly necessary for a given relationship and which ones would add complexity without reducing meaningful risk. This risk-based approach helps the organization focus its contractual effort where it matters most and avoids turning every vendor discussion into the same blunt process regardless of actual exposure. Some security requirements appear again and again because they address concerns that are common across many vendor relationships. One important area is access control, which includes who at the vendor can reach systems or data connected to the customer and under what conditions that access is granted, reviewed, changed, or removed. Another is data handling, which includes how information is stored, transmitted, retained, shared, and eventually disposed of when it is no longer needed. Change management may also matter, especially when the vendor's modifications could affect the customer's systems, users, or security posture. Incident reporting is another major area because the organization needs to know when the vendor must communicate about security events, how quickly that communication should occur, and what cooperation is expected during investigation or recovery. These examples help show that security requirements are not abstract add-ons. They are practical expressions of what the business needs in order to keep a vendor relationship from becoming an unmanaged source of risk. Good contracts place those expectations where both parties can see them and plan around them. Incident-related language deserves special attention because it is one of the areas where weak contracts often create serious problems at the worst possible time. If a vendor experiences a breach, service outage, data exposure, or suspicious event affecting the customer, everyone suddenly wants clear answers about who must be notified, how fast the notification must happen, what information will be shared, and what support the vendor must provide. A contract that says almost nothing about these points may leave the customer learning about serious issues too late or struggling to get the information needed to make decisions. Strong incident terms do not have to be dramatic to be useful. They simply need to be clear enough that both sides understand expectations before a stressful event occurs. This may include notice timing, the types of incidents that require communication, the level of detail expected, cooperation with investigation, support for containment or recovery, and responsibilities related to regulators or affected customers where appropriate. When these points are handled well, the contract becomes a source of structure during confusion rather than another problem to argue over while time is being lost. Another important contractual area is the right to receive evidence or assurance about the vendor's control environment. Many organizations do not have the ability or the business need to inspect every detail of a vendor's security operations directly, but they still need reasonable visibility into whether promised safeguards remain in place. This is where contracts often address assessment rights, reporting obligations, or the sharing of independent review results when appropriate. For a beginner, the key idea is simple. If the organization cannot see anything meaningful after the contract is signed, then it may be depending on trust with very little validation. That is risky, especially when the vendor handles critical services or sensitive information. Evidence does not always mean direct inspection by the customer. It may come through reports, attestations, review summaries, performance measures, or agreed-upon meetings that help the customer understand whether the vendor's security condition is stable, improving, or weakening. A strong contract does not guarantee perfect transparency in every relationship, but it should support enough visibility that the customer is not forced to manage serious dependency in the dark. Subcontracting and fourth-party dependency also matter far more than many beginners expect. A vendor may seem well managed during selection, but part of that service may rely on other outside providers that the customer never sees directly. Those downstream relationships can introduce new data flows, new operational dependencies, new geographic exposures, and new failure points that weaken the original assurance if they are not understood. This is why contractual language often needs to address whether the vendor can use subcontractors freely, whether the customer must be informed, and whether equivalent security requirements must flow down to those third parties. The point is not to block every form of subcontracting. In many industries, outside dependency is normal and sometimes unavoidable. The real issue is whether the customer knows where material parts of the service are being performed and whether those downstream participants are held to standards that match the risk of the relationship. Without that attention, a strong-looking vendor can quietly pass sensitive responsibilities into weaker environments that were never part of the customer's original comfort level. Security requirements in contracts also need to account for legal and privacy obligations, especially when the vendor touches personal data, regulated records, or business information that carries retention and disclosure responsibilities. A business cannot simply hand off important information to an outside provider and assume the risk has been transferred away. In many cases, the original organization remains responsible for how that information is protected and managed, even when a vendor is doing part of the work. That is why contracts often need to address topics such as permitted use of data, limits on sharing, storage location, return or deletion at the end of the relationship, cooperation with legal requests, and notification duties when a privacy-related event occurs. For a new learner, the big lesson is that security and privacy obligations often meet inside the contract, not as totally separate conversations. A vendor may provide great functionality and still create unacceptable exposure if the agreement does not align with the organization's regulatory, customer, and internal commitments. Good security management pays close attention to that alignment before the relationship is allowed to deepen. Even a well-written contract, however, does not remove the need for ongoing vendor monitoring. This is one of the most important ideas in the whole topic. A contract sets expectations at a point in time, but the relationship continues through system changes, staffing turnover, mergers, evolving threats, financial shifts, and operational pressures that may affect the vendor's behavior and stability after the agreement is signed. Ongoing monitoring is how the customer checks whether the relationship still looks the way it was expected to look. That oversight may involve regular meetings, performance reviews, issue tracking, incident follow-up, evidence review, service reporting, reassessment triggers, or attention to changes in the vendor's environment that could alter risk. The purpose is not to harass the vendor or create endless administration. The purpose is to keep the organization from drifting into blind dependence on a provider whose condition may no longer match the assumptions made during selection. Monitoring is what helps the customer notice when a vendor relationship is improving, slipping, or changing in ways that deserve new decisions. A helpful way to think about ongoing monitoring is that it should reflect both performance and risk. Performance tells the customer whether the vendor is delivering the agreed service in a reliable and timely way. Risk tells the customer whether the relationship's exposure is stable or whether warning signs are starting to appear. These are related, but they are not identical. A vendor can meet normal service expectations while quietly weakening its control environment, and a vendor can have a temporary service problem without creating lasting security risk if the issue is handled responsibly. That is why monitoring should include more than basic uptime or delivery measures. Depending on the nature of the relationship, the organization may also watch incident trends, access-related concerns, unresolved security issues, significant architectural changes, staff turnover in key roles, dependency changes, or overdue remediation of agreed weaknesses. Some organizations use measures such as Key Performance Indicator, KPI, and Key Risk Indicator, KRI, values to make this oversight more structured. But the beginner-level lesson is simply that both service quality and security exposure deserve attention if the customer wants a full picture of vendor health. Review frequency should also be tied to the level of risk and criticality in the relationship. A vendor supporting low-risk services may need only occasional review, especially if there is little access, little sensitive information involved, and few operational dependencies. A high-risk or business-critical vendor usually requires more regular attention because the cost of waiting too long can be very high if something significant changes. Monitoring is therefore not a one-size-fits-all calendar exercise. It is a risk-based governance activity. The organization should think about what kind of relationship it has, how much trust it has placed in the vendor, and how quickly trouble could affect customers, operations, or regulatory responsibilities if the vendor's condition deteriorates. That assessment helps define how often meetings occur, what evidence should be refreshed, what changes must be reported, and which events should trigger immediate reassessment outside normal schedule. Strong vendor monitoring is not about constant suspicion. It is about keeping attention proportional to the real business dependence involved so that important relationships do not become invisible simply because they have become familiar. Another crucial area is change awareness. Vendors do not stay static, and one of the biggest risks in long-term relationships is that important changes happen quietly while the customer continues acting as if the original assessment still applies. A vendor may be acquired, move services to a new platform, change key subcontractors, open operations in new regions, reduce staffing, experience repeated incidents, or alter the way customer data is processed. Each of those changes can affect the risk profile of the relationship, sometimes in ways that are not immediately obvious. A mature contract and monitoring approach, therefore, tries to create visibility into material changes and gives the customer a way to review whether the relationship still fits the organization's requirements and tolerance. This does not mean every minor update needs formal escalation. It means the customer should not be surprised by major changes that affect security, resilience, privacy, or dependency. Ongoing monitoring works best when it is connected to an alert mindset around change rather than only to routine reporting. In vendor governance, a familiar relationship can still become a new risk if conditions shift and nobody notices soon enough. When monitoring uncovers issues, the customer also needs a practical way to respond. This is where governance becomes more than observation. If the vendor misses security-related obligations, delays communication, fails to remediate weaknesses, or shows worsening signs of instability, the organization should know how concerns are documented, who owns the issue internally, what escalation path exists, and what decisions may follow if performance does not improve. Some problems may require simple remediation tracking and closer follow-up. Others may lead to executive review, contract enforcement, temporary restrictions, increased oversight, or eventually a decision to replace the vendor if the risk becomes too great. A contract supports this process because it gives structure to what was promised, while monitoring supplies the evidence showing whether those promises are being kept. For a beginner, this is a very practical lesson. Security management is not just about spotting a problem. It is also about creating a repeatable way to act on that problem before it grows into disruption, exposure, or a larger governance failure that the business could have addressed earlier. As we close, the central lesson is that contractual security requirements and ongoing vendor monitoring are what transform vendor trust from a hopeful assumption into a managed business relationship. Strong contracts define expectations in ways that reflect the real risk of the service, while strong monitoring keeps those expectations alive after the ink is dry and real operations begin. Together, they help the organization address access, data handling, incident response, privacy, resilience, evidence, subcontracting, material change, and accountability in a disciplined way that supports both business goals and security obligations. Weak programs often fail because they either stop at vendor selection or treat the contract as a static legal file that nobody revisits until something goes wrong. For a new CISM learner, the most important insight is that vendor risk does not end when the provider is chosen. It is managed throughout the life of the relationship. When contracts are written thoughtfully and monitoring is carried out with steady, risk-based attention, the organization is far better prepared to benefit from outside services without drifting into unmanaged dependence or preventable exposure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.